is Adrian Bennett, and I'm in the history department here. And I'd like to welcome you to this evening's lecture. Can you hear me? Which one's yours? Okay. This one, it's this one, all right. Well, there's nothing to turn on this thing. It just hangs here. You want me? I'm not going to hang it off my neck here. Like this? Is that better? All right. I'll start this again. My name is Adrian Bennett, and I'm in the history department here. And I'd like to welcome you to this evening's lecture. And I also like to thank the lectures committee and the government of the student body for bringing in our guest lecturer this evening. The lecturer this evening is Professor Paul T.K. Lin. He was born in British Columbia, in Vancouver. He was educated at the University of British Columbia, at the University of Michigan, at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and at Harvard University. Upon receiving his degree at Harvard, he and his family moved to China in 1949-1950 and stayed there for nearly 15 years until 1964. While he was there, he worked as a writer, as a translator, and as a teacher of English journalism, of international law, and the history of international relations. Towards the end of his time in China, he became good friends with Zhou Enlai. He was not, however, as rumor has had it on this campus, and apparently is also, the rumor circulates in other parts of the world, he was not a private secretary to Zhou Enlai. In 1964, the Lins moved back to Canada, where he began to teach Chinese and East Asian history courses at McGill University. And at the same time, he began to develop a program in East Asian studies as the director of the East Asian Center at McGill University. He has returned to China many times since 1964, most recently in January of this year. He is keenly interested in promoting the mutual understanding between Chinese and American Canadian peoples, and he has lectured widely and is a frequent commentator in the public media. Currently, he is researching the relationship between social change and economic growth in the development strategy of the People's Republic of China. I believe we are very fortunate to have him with us this evening, and he will be addressing us on the topic, China Enters the 21st Century. I'd like you to welcome Professor Paul T.K. Lin.
Thank you, Professor Bennett. Oh, yeah. I think it just goes around your neck this way. Oh, that's right. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege and it's a great privilege to be here and to be speaking to the people of Iowa. I think this is my first experience of coming in contact with Iowans, and a very pleasant one indeed for me, especially now, shortly after the normalization of relations between the American and Chinese peoples, the possibility of interchange between these two great peoples is very much enhanced. And during the ride from the airport here, I was delighted to be informed that there have already been a number of delegations from the People's Republic of China, and I hope that's only the beginning of a very extensive relationship. Partly it must be based upon the fact that Iowa is one of the grain baskets of the United States, and there is indeed an enormous potential for mutually beneficial relations of trade between the farmers of Iowa and the people of China. And aside from that, possibly many other areas in which there can be exchanges. Certainly, not least of all, cultural exchange of peoples, which will serve to deepen the understanding between the Chinese and American people, which has been broken off for several decades owing to unfortunate policies that have been adopted in the past. I find it always a difficult challenge to meet to talk about China in one evening, and I'm going to try to do it again tonight. Mainly, what I would like to address myself to is the question of exactly what China is all about today, whether or not, in fact, the China after the death of Mao Zedong has changed course, whether this new China, or seemingly a China with new policies, benefits or otherwise the people of the West, and particularly of the United States, and what the potential is for relations between the two countries in the light of the changes that are taking place in China. It's almost impossible, of course, to talk about the current situation in China without discussing a little bit some of the main lines of development of the past period in Chinese history, because, in fact, what we're talking about is not simply a country and a society, but a civilization, and furthermore, the largest civilization in the world, one of the great mother civilizations with the largest population, the longest continuous history, and now in a state of rapid transformation, more rapidly changing than any other country on earth. A country that was unchanging for many millennia is now at the forefront of change. It's this staggering picture of a country, a civilization going through very dramatic and fundamental change that we are witnessing today. And it is the breadth and the depth of these changes that give rise to the many phenomena that some of us may find a little bit challenging and bewildering to grasp. Since we're living right in the midst of this period, we don't have the advantage of historical hindsight that future generations will have. Perhaps we should begin by accepting the fact that China today is holding the legacy of a civilization that up to perhaps the 15th century was not only in the forefront of cultural development as a great civilization, but in fact also in the forefront of technological and scientific development. One of the good and rather less known examples of this is the fact that in the Ming Dynasty, during the early part of the 16th century, of the 15th century, a great Chinese admiral named Zheng He led an armada of Chinese ships to the South Seas and all the way across the Indian Ocean to the east coast of Africa and perhaps even beyond, carrying 10,000 men, and made so many trips and touched upon so many lands that it was in a saga that made the voyage of Christopher Columbus in the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria about half a century later seem very small by comparison. In fact, in terms of the size of the ships, probably the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria could have been put on the decks of one of the biggest of the battle junks of the Chinese Navy at the time. Yet the strange thing was that historically, despite this tremendous superiority in naval power, the Chinese never created any colonies, although there were many Chinese settlers who went to the South Seas and other parts of the world. China never secured any of these areas as colonies. I'm not going into the historical circumstances and the reasons for that kind of a development in contrast to European expansionism. What I'm suggesting here is that in an earlier period, the glory of Chinese civilization was its ability to give, to a certain degree, a cultural brilliance that benefited the rest of the world. And if we think a bit about the course of European history and European modernization, and contemplate for a moment that some of the great inventions that made possible the modernization of Europe came originally from the East, and in particular from China. Best examples of these are paper, the printing press, the compass, gunpowder, which may or may not have been a great boon to mankind, and the sternpost rudder, the horse stirrup, and a myriad other inventions. Those of you who are interested in this aspect of scientific history should, if you wish, read the monumental work by Dr. Joseph Needham on science and civilization in China. However, around the 15th and 16th century, there occurred changes in Europe whereby the Europeans spurted ahead of China. The opening of the New World, creation of new scientific advances, technological breakthroughs made possible not only a very large development in production, which allowed Europe to leap ahead of China, not only economically, but also in terms of institutions, social systems, and so forth. And by the 19th century, Europe was, in these respects, far ahead of China. And most of the European countries, and later Japan, made use of that superiority to invade China and to launch a number of wars which reduced China to a semi-colony. The trauma of that experience, the first foreign barbarian invasions which were carried out by countries which not only had superior military prowess, but in many respects also superior institutions, was something that China had a century ago suffered, and since then has been trying to overcome. The experience that China suffered from the Opium War on was one of trying to overcome not only her military weakness, which at first she tried to do by creating factories modeled after the Western armories, but also to create some of the institutions and the social structures which made possible some of the developments in the West. And although the Republican Revolution led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen overthrew the imperial monarchy in 1911, it did not basically change much of the social structure of China or the institutions and values of the feudal and semi-feudal system. The modern revolution actually began about 60 years ago, in almost to the day, when the intellectuals of China, joining with the workers and later with the peasantry, called for a basic social revolution in order to achieve the purpose of modernizing China, both in terms of her economy and in terms of her society. And this was a famous May 4th movement of 1919. It's about that time that the intellectuals who were disillusioned with the attempt to found a democracy patterned after the Western democracies discovered in the experience of the Soviet Union a possible alternative avenue to the salvation of China. And it was from that period on that the Chinese Revolution was led by intellectuals who espoused the ideas of Marx and Lenin. The Chinese Communist movement was born in 1921, and its original inspiration was not simply to take on a foreign dogma as a religion. Its purpose was to try to use Marxism as a tool to achieve the modernization of China's economy and society. To save China, to turn her into a strong country able to resist aggression from abroad and to eliminate feudal oppression from within. No other basic purpose was behind these early leaders of the Chinese Communist movement. And whether it was called communism or any other name didn't bother them. What they were concerned about was to find some kind of clue, some kind of program that would solve the problem of China's weakness and backwardness. In the May 4th movement, the two slogans were science and democracy, to seek a way to make Chinese society follow the paths of science, of modern science, and to seek a way of democratizing China's social institutions to overcome feudal tyranny. which still existed despite the overthrow of the ancien regime. So if you think in terms of this long genesis of the Chinese Revolution, we might say that what we see in China today is the outcome of these 6 decades of difficult, hard struggle. The struggle of a nation and its leaders to save their civilization and to bring it up to the front ranks of world civilization. In those terms, it's perhaps easier to understand some of the difficulties that the Chinese Revolution underwent. Because after all, what was happening was the attempt to transform ideas and institutions that were rooted in traditions that were 2,000 years old. The Confucian value system, with its strict hierarchical structure, its relations of subservience and authority, the prince and his subject, the father and the son, the husband and the wife, were all unequal relationships. And all of the rites, the rituals, were restricted the freedom, the initiative, the independent thought of the average Chinese citizen. All of these things had to be overthrown and replaced with a new freedom which would in turn make possible the initiatives and the creative capacities of the people to build a new industrialized, modern economy. That kind of a task the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong, tried to achieve. And for 3 decades, they fought a war. One after another, they fought wars to try to achieve political power in order to start China on the road to a new social order. When they finally did, after fighting the foreign imperialists and then the Japanese during the war with Japan and finally the Kuomintang, when they finally did achieve political power in 1949, they were faced with an enormous task. A task that was greater than the War of Liberation, the task of how to transform China. Prior to that, they had seen as the obstacles in the way of China's advance all of the old forces, not only the foreign powers who preyed on China, but also the domestic rulers who preyed on the Chinese people. They were predators on the land, the landlords, and they were predators in the government, the so-called bureaucrat capitalists headed by Chiang Kai-shek. But after 1949, the situation changed. Who was it now that stood in the way of their movement towards a better life and a modernized society? Mao Zedong tried to clarify the picture by saying that it was now, in Marxist terms, the proletariat who had one power pitted against the bourgeoisie. In fact, in 1949, the bourgeoisie was not very strong. and hardly able to create any kind of problems. In fact, China was in a pre-capitalist stage. But in the Marxist schema of historical change, one would have to assume that the stage of socialism comes only after capitalism. And so the process of telescoping history began to try to bring China up to what might have been the productive capacity of a capitalist industrialized state without its exploitative institutions and values, and then to move quickly into socialism. And this is what Mao Zedong had the Chinese people take upon themselves. So very quickly, from 1949 to 1952, a period of rehabilitation, he tried to consolidate what was actually the revolution that should have taken place normally in the history of Europe. It should have taken several centuries to carry out in terms of building a modern capitalist society out of the Middle Ages. And from about the mid-50s on, Mao Zedong tried to get the whole of China to move into socialism. That transition involved, first and foremost, changing the ownership of the farms and the factories of China in putting these major producers of value into the hands of the public rather than the private sector, either in the collective form or in the form of state ownership. Industry, commerce, agriculture, all were transformed. In the agriculture, in the form of cooperatives, and later communes. And by 1956, 57, this process had been completed. A lightning move in historical terms of a transformation that should have taken a much longer period of historical time. Question then arose as to whether or not China had really achieved its purposes in changing its society. And some people felt that indeed the social changes were enough for the time being, and what really China needed to concentrate on was to increase its technological and productive capacity to catch up with its social system. This was the position that was attributed, for example, to Liu Shaoqi. One of the basic issues at stake here was whether or not the thinking of people, their mentality, their values, their outlook, was keeping pace with all the tremendous transformations that had already taken place in the economic and social structure of China. Mao Zedong felt that they were not keeping pace, and that in fact some of the leaders themselves were not keeping pace with a continuing process of change. And therefore, he began to talk about changes in the ideas, in the consciousness, in the thinking of the leadership as a means to push China forward, to release the forces of production, to move China more quickly towards modernization. This was one of the reasons for abandoning the Soviet model, which in the first 5-year plan up to 1957 had moved China forward, but slowly, and was beginning to produce a a certain amount of polarization in society, for example, in the creation of elitist elements, both in the government as well as in the managerial stratum. Mao Zedong's purpose was to instill in people's minds the idea, which was, of course, had never been tested in practice in any country, that economic growth can be achieved without sacrificing the values of egalitarianism, the values of a society moving towards more and more social justice. In other words, what he was proposing was that there is no inherent antithesis between social change and economic growth. In fact, social change, progressive social change, which means reducing and ultimately eliminating social disparities, should reinforce technological and productive advances and economic growth. The standard version of development is that it proceeds by the creation of disparities. That is to say, you cannot achieve economic growth without having some sort of accumulation, and accumulation can only be achieved in the private sector, and there you can get a higher rate of savings under certain circumstances, and a higher rate of savings means a higher rate of investment, and thereby you get economic growth. To take part. The mass line, stimulating people by putting faith in them, trying to get the best out of the resources in hand, both material and human resources. The famous principle of walking on two legs. You don't have high technology, use low technology as well as high technology. When you get high technology, fine. If you don't have it, use whatever you have. Walking on two legs instead of one leg speeds up the process. And so forth and so on. Many innovative ideas about development were started in the Great Leap Forward. Unfortunately, the Great Leap Forward did not achieve what it set out to do. Perhaps in part it did, but in some respects, some important, significant respects, it did not. Certainly in terms of building a basic infrastructure that would make the regeneration of capital become an automatic, self-perpetuating process, that did not take place. Although many reservoirs, irrigation systems, and so forth were built, something was lacking. And there were mistakes made, for example, trying to make steel in the backyards. This idea, of course, comes from people who are not experienced in modern industry. People who did not, as the Chinese say now, quite fully grasp the laws of economic development. Nevertheless, the Great Leap Forward was a tremendous experiment in trying to mobilize the whole people. And perhaps, as we look back on this period with hindsight, one of its greatest problems lay in the fact that just prior to the Great Leap Forward, the intellectuals had been denigrated by the anti-rightist movement. During that movement, many intellectuals were not only stigmatized as being conservatives, But the rest of the intellectuals who are not even stigmatized lost their self-confidence and therefore did not take as active a part, certainly in the leadership, as they ought to have in the building up of the country. Had the intellectuals not been denigrated, and in fact, if the opposite had happened, just prior to the Great Leap Forward, if the intellectuals had been guided to put all their energies fully into the Great Leap Forward, the Great Leap Forward might have had a very different outcome and might have had a fair test as an alternative approach to development. But because there were some serious errors, and because of the drop in production that took place shortly afterwards with the 3 years of bad harvests, partly owing to the bad weather, there were many criticisms of this basic policy and strategy of Mao Zedong's. And Mao Zedong began to feel that there was strong resistance within his own party and within his own top leadership to his basic strategies, which was this attempt to keep moving in the direction of narrowing disparities, of more social justice, at the same time as you are trying to build up the economy. And when the resistance became apparently more and more solidified, he hit upon the only way in which he thought he could make a breakthrough, and that is to arouse the whole people to participate in a cultural revolution. Cultural revolution was essentially a political revolution. That is to say, it was an attempt to remove from positions of authority and power those people who resisted his strategy of development, his strategies of transformation and economic growth, social transformation and economic growth. And to try to put in their place new leadership at all levels who were sensitive to the possibilities of this massive mobilization method of development and who were responsive to the people. This was the original conception behind the Cultural Revolution. And the original rationale for his famous call to the people of China to rebel. It's the first time in history that any government has called upon its people to rebel. And of course, the rationale behind that was that there were actually two headquarters in China, one of which was Mao's and the other one was Liu Shaoqi's. The idea was not to rebel against his headquarters, of course, but against Liu Shaoqi's. Nevertheless, the idea of rebellion, the idea that there were capitalist roaders at the very top who wanted to lead China back on the road to capitalism rather than to socialism, aroused a furor of political activity in China, which plunged China into turmoil that lasted 10 years. I won't go through the detailed record of these 10 years. I think if we were to characterize the Cultural Revolution as a major attempt to change society and to try to draw up a balance sheet of its successes and failures according to its own terms, I think we might have to say that perhaps the balance sheet is not just 70 good and 30 bad, as the Mao Zedong himself has appraised the Cultural Revolution, but perhaps one has to say that it's a little more serious than that in terms of its failure to achieve some of its original goals. But again, the circumstances must be seen in perspective, because when the Cultural Revolution began, Mao Zedong made it clear that he thought that only a very small handful of people stood opposed to his basic strategies. But by the time he wrote his big character poster and called on people to rebel, many people, especially young people, began to think that everybody who had any authority whatsoever was a capitalist roader. And this was encouraged by demagogues who tried to make use of the movement as a means of achieving power. Among the more prominent of these people, and there were people whose names that you won't be acquainted with, but certainly Lin Biao became one of the prominent culprits in this whole process. And later, of course, the Gang of Four, including Mao's wife. And these people who had deep-going ambitions to take over control, used the slogans of the Cultural Revolution as a means to, as demagogic means to achieve power. So that in the process of opening up the floodgates of change by activating to the maximum the people of China, what Mao Zedong perhaps underestimated was the degree to which this process could be manipulated by careerists and demagogues. And also underestimated the degree to which a society which is still suffering from poverty and backwardness can achieve an understanding of some of the basic principles that Mao Zedong espoused, such as, for example, serve the people, such as, for example, concern for the greater collective, such as, for example, allowing those who are the most underprivileged to take over authority, try their hand at guiding the nation's destinies. So what in fact instead happened was that some of his ideas were corrupted into the opposite of what he intended. And anything good, you can be absolutely certain that anything good which is brought to an extreme form becomes an absurdity. Even honesty, even love. Carry it to its logical extreme, and it becomes its opposite. This is what happened in the case of some of the precepts that Mao Zedong disseminated. For example, Mao Zedong called upon the people to make possible the participation of workers and peasants in the universities and colleges of China, higher education. Get those who are politically underprivileged to get into positions of authority and power. You must educate them, give them the chance to be educated. Education must serve the workers and peasants. It must be combined with productive labor. And so what happened was, for example, the opening of the universities to the workers and peasants, based largely upon their political orientation and their class background rather than on their academic capacities. If you carry that to an extreme, and forget entirely about academic competence, the result is that you no longer have a university. Standards have dropped too far. Or, for example, the case of the students, the high school students who came out of the Cultural Revolution. These young people were told that in order for them to carry out the policy that Mao Zedong had espoused, that is to combine education with productive labor in order that they will know that China will not keep on producing an elite, an educated elite that is separated from the people. One way to institutionalize this so that you will not continually produce an elite is to send young people after graduation from high school into the villages, onto the farms, to work for 2 or 3 years with their hands. And presumably this would at least dissipate some of their intellectual errors and make them respect honest labor. Some of the peasants' fine, selfish values would rub off on them, and they would come back to the cities, if they do, as better people, better human beings. The concept behind it was that the process of admission into university should then be changed to take into consideration, first and foremost, the value orientation of the entrance into the university curriculum. These people would then be tested first and foremost by their working peers as to whether they deserved a university education. Whether, for example, they were selfish people or people dedicated to the interests of the whole people. If they were, then they would be recommended for admission to college. And academic competence was a requirement, but not the only one. But you carry that principle, there's a balanced or an optimum way whereby you can implement this principle. But if you carry it to its extreme, if it's manipulated, then what happens? What happens is that, in fact, in areas where there is not the best kind of leadership, it deteriorates into choice by the first secretary of the party committee in the village. And everybody will be, all of these party secretaries will be surrounded by sycophants who are trying to get on the best side of him in order to get their children into college and so forth. Influence peddling will become widespread because the value system has not permeated that much, and some of the institutionalized structures, institutionalized safeguards are not there to prevent this kind of abuse, then this is what would happen. Well, these were some of the abuses that did take place. And of course, there are other problems. You suddenly send several million young people from the cities into the countryside, and I'm sure that if we started sending some people from Des Moines into the farms, young people into the farms, I'm not sure that they would be a blessing or something else. They became a burden on the farmers. Not only in terms of housing, but also food, and also there's a cultural gap between the young men and the young men and women in the villages and the young men and women who had just come in from a more sophisticated environment. Problems of marriage, of settling down, problems of keeping up the education of young people while they were in the village, which were sometimes culturally rather in the backwaters. These problems arose, but they you just didn't have enough time. China didn't have the economic base to solve these problems immediately. It's a huge country, and the problems that were created were enormous. So these again became issues that could be manipulated by careerists, by demagogues, and by all sorts of people who weren't in the mainstream of socialist thinking. The result is that the Cultural Revolution was partly unsuccessful in achieving its goals. One of the serious consequences of the failure to get the educational system going on the new principles is that a gap began to emerge between the older generation and the new generation in terms of their capacity for participation in modernization of China, in terms of their scientific expertise. And so today you find in China a phenomenon which is known in Chinese as qing huang bu jie. This is the phenomenon of the golden and the green do not meet. In other words, it's the period when farmers are talking, you probably have something similar to this in Iowa, I'm sure. But it doesn't have the same connotation, of course. That is, your winter harvest has all been eaten up. The spring wheat has not yet ripened. Between the golden and the green, there is a gap. When you've eaten up, if you are on a subsistence level, that is, what you've already produced, and the new crop hasn't come in yet. And that's what's happening to China's skilled people, professionals, scientists, engineers, doctors. There is a gap because the higher education has been neglected as a result of the distortion of the Cultural Revolution under the ultra-left leadership. So today, what China is trying to do is to catch up, to make up for those 10 lost years, and to go back to a more dialectical or a more balanced way of looking at development. That development cannot be based upon empty slogans and just political phrasemongering. It has to be based on solid, hard work and study. It has to be based on genuine science. And first and foremost, the importance of economic development must be restored to its proper position as primary, and that the emphasis on human values must come with it. But socialism cannot be built on the basis of poverty. The original conception of socialism was that it should be the natural outcome of high productivity, not low productivity, but the highest possible productivity under the previous social system should bring about socialism. But if you start talking about egalitarianism, when you are on a very low level of production, what happens is, in China we call it 大锅饭, 吃大锅饭. What is 吃大锅饭? It means, literally it means eating out of the big pot. I don't know whether you have anything similar in English. The nearest thing I can think of is freeloading. If there's very low level of production, how do you divide the social product? If you divide it equally, that means a lot of people will be tempted to freeload on the others. And in fact, that's what happened in many cases. It's the lazy ones, it's the incompetents who will gain out of such a system. This is not true egalitarianism. So people who say that China is moving towards capitalism and moving back have to contemplate that aspect of it. What is really backward is to encourage low productivity, encourage laziness and incompetence and empty phrase-mongering in the place of hard work. Because in socialism, which is a period that's still supposed to be much more productive, but still not, you haven't yet produced more than enough for everybody. The principle still should be that you should be compensated for your work. The more you contribute, the more you should get. At some stage in future, maybe 100, 200 years from now, the United States should be much closer than that. You can distribute according to need. And, a mother with 5 children should have 5 times as much as a bachelor who may be producing more machines than she, but she's produced 5 children, which is much more important than those machines. And in any case, she needs it. She needs 5 times as much for living. And she should get it. But that's in the future. It's not today. Should be today in America, by the way, but that's... in China, certainly, it's not today. So to talk about that kind of illusion as a reality doesn't help move China towards a better society. Objectively, it moved China backward. And so there is a new sorting and resorting out of values going on in China. Personally, I don't think that it should go all the way back. And now you're going to say material incentives are the main dynamic of development in China. Let's go back to the capitalist system. It's great, Look at what's happened in America. 3 refrigerators, 4 cars per family, something like that. It's great. Consumerism is not the solution for China. Certainly, it's probably the most dangerous thing possible is to create that kind of expectation as the final value of a society. But I still believe, however, that there will be a strong legacy that cannot be wiped out of Mao Zedong's thinking. That is, and this is a term that I've used for many years to describe it, forward socialization. That is to say that people's values should be a little ahead of the actual state of affairs. In other words, although you still have relative poverty, you still have to go rigidly by the principle of to each according to his work, from each according to his ability, and that is really what you mean by a more just society. Nevertheless, we should encourage people who have that higher consciousness to do more than their share and to get less than they deserve and feel quite happy about it because they're contributing to society. that kind of value system should be encouraged, but it should not be the criterion for distribution of the social product. The combination of those two ideas, this forward socialization, so that people will see the future in terms of a more just society in which people will be behaving much less selfishly than now, and the reality today where you encourage people, both the selfish ones as well as the unselfish ones, to do their best for the society at large. This, it seems to me, is the combination that you need in China today. To eliminate one or the other would be backward moving rather than forward moving. So what have you got today? You've got the Gang of Four overthrown. These are people who were obviously, not only were they demagogues, but they didn't even believe in anything that they were talking about. Jiang Qing talks about the poor and the underprivileged and the masked line and so forth, while she buys hundreds of foreign movies and enjoys them in the privacy of her own palace. Closes off a public park in order to ride her horse in there for years on end. And this is the kind of person who talks about egalitarianism. This is the kind of thing that disillusioned many young people, made them, in some cases, made them cynical. But now that they have been repudiated, now that the critique of these ultra-left elements has been done as thoroughly as possible, there is a new feeling in China of a great new mobilization of energy to move ahead, based upon some of the ideas that the new leadership, with Hua Guofeng as chairman and Deng Xiaoping as the first deputy vice chairman, have put forward. The four modernizations: the modernization of agriculture and industry, of science and technology, and of national defense, are the order of the day. And these modernizations can only be achieved by encouraging everybody to put out his best effort. That means that expertise, intellectual capacities, competence in work will be at a premium. And people will be recognized, not denigrated, for making their intellectual achievements. It means that the whole society is going to put together its efforts to get the economy going again, not at the level of 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but preferably at the level of the technologies of the 1970s. That is why there is a great need for the importation of technology. China's program today demands within the next few years, by 1985, the targets are, of course, rather staggering targets, and targets that probably are perhaps in some respects a little bit over what is realistically achievable, but they call for increasing the tonnage of steel from what last year was about 31 million tons to 60 million tons by 1985, increasing the production of food grains from something like 280 million tons to 400 million tons by 1985. 10 times as much crude oil, 5 new harbors, 6 new trunk railways, 30 new generating stations, power generating stations, about 120 big new projects are in hand for development by 1985. 1985 is a crucial year because this is the period development requires great amounts of capital. It's not just a question of mobilizing the people, but a capital investment that has been estimated by Vice Premier Lee Hsien-Loong at around $600 billion by 1985. Most of that, of course, will be internally generated, but because of the requirement for high technology which has been demanded, there will probably be a need for at least $20 to $30 billion worth of foreign credit in order to import the necessary equipment and technology to modernize China's industries. There's been questions raised, and I have raised them myself months ago, about the speed at which this is going to go and whether it can be achieved at that rate. And I think the recent reassessment of the situation by the State Council in China is a reflection of the fact that there has been some imbalance owing to this speed of development. Some of the Japanese projects, for example, have been re-examined. I don't think there has been any policy change in basic terms, but there has been a reassessment of priorities. Because some projects are more crucial than others. Power generation, for example, transportation, telecommunications, building materials, these are crucial, critical. But there are other projects that can wait a little bit longer. These priorities are being re-examined, and there undoubtedly will be a much steadier progress and more coordination than before. Because at one point there was a great deal of devolution so that even the local enterprises were able to deal directly with the foreign contractors. Now this will be much more tightly controlled in order to conserve foreign exchange for the vital needs of the country. Well, nevertheless, I think this is a very healthy development because it means that China will now be assured of going along a much more steady and carefully planned path. As far as that affects the trade with the United States and the West in general, I can only say that if you have a market of 900 million people or nearly 1 billion people, that is staggering enough. But to think of it in terms of a developing country, that just is unimaginable in its potential. I don't think that Americans, however, should think in terms of immediate, sudden windfall of contracts. The market is enormous, but it needs to be developed steadily with a great deal of long-range planning and thinking, and a genuinely based upon friendship and equality and cooperative relationships. On that basis, it seems to me that the natural partner that China has is with the United States in the development of its economy. This, I think, is not only for the rest of the century, but will go beyond into the 21st century. I don't want to run over my time. I'll just finish my remarks with a comment on the international aspects of the current situation. The fact that China is attempting to overcome many problems and to modernize on the scale and at the speed that she is trying to modernize means that she needs a peaceful environment for a long time to come. And that, I think, is one of the principal goals of her foreign policy. to combat the tendencies in the world towards aggressive war. It doesn't mean, however, that she will stand and allow herself to be attacked, and that is the basis for her behavior, for example, towards Vietnam. Vietnam was a country which China spent much money and material and in fact sacrificed a great deal to assist in the past, not only with food, but raw materials and even a great deal of technical assistance. But the situation has, in the perception of the China's leaders, changed considerably during the past recent period. And today, Vietnam is no longer the Vietnam of yesterday. From the Chinese point of view, Vietnam has now become not the victim, but the author of aggression. From China's point of view, Vietnam is no longer the prey of a superpower, but the pawn, the instrument of the most dangerous superpower in the world, the Soviet Union. And its invasion of Cambodia is a symptom of its role as such. Its provocations on China's border, about which China warned many months before it launched its counterattack. 700 provocations only within the last few months are another symptom. One has to look more carefully at the sequence of events to understand what was happening. In September last year, Soviet Union and Vietnam signed a treaty of alliance. Soviet Union cajoled Vietnam into joining the Comecon. The relationship with the Warsaw Pact became one of a global grouping around the Soviet Union and following the Soviet Union's global strategies. The invasion of Cambodia and the conflict with China followed. Now, from the point of view of China, it has always been consistent policy for her to respond firmly and quickly to provocations of this sort, no matter who it is, whether it's a superpower or a small bully or a big bully. And this, I think, is her position. It's not very easily understood by Westerners because people think of Vietnam as the underdog, as a tiny, small country. Here's this huge bully China up there picking on little Vietnam again. The Vietnamese people have suffered enough, and here they are. The Chinese are picking on them again. And I'm sorry to say that perhaps many of my American friends probably still have a little bit of residual trauma on the Vietnam War and can't bring themselves to condemn Vietnam for invading Cambodia. If we can do it, why should we blame somebody else? But it seems to me that it's precisely on the principle that those of you who didn't believe it was proper, even more so now should, it seems to me, understand why China condemns the invasion of Cambodia. The question is not one of the size of the countries, it's a principle that is involved. The issue is larger in strategic terms from the Chinese point of view because it sees the whole Vietnam, the whole Indochina Peninsula as one of the strategic bases, one of the most important for Soviet global strategy in terms of controlling the jugular vein of strategic traffic between Japan and the Middle East, for example, of controlling the whole of Southeast Asia, outflanking China on the south, while the Soviet Union is building its bases all around China. Up in the north there's, for example, the 6th Airborne Division at Khabarovsk, which covers not only northeast China, but Japan. Soviet Union has recently been building a 3,500-meter runway in the southernmost island of the Kurils, and that also covers Japan as well as China. And once that is achieved, then it makes it possible for the Soviet Union frees its hands for a movement, quick movement in the Middle East and in Europe. And one has to look at the whole global thing in order to understand what the Soviet Union's view of Vietnam is. Chinese position, as I understand it, would find the view that this is a minor and thing, the Chinese should have left them alone. Why couldn't they just leave them alone? As the height of naivete. From China's own experience, they have always responded in terms of their saying, 人不犯我，我不犯人；人要犯我，我必犯人。That is to say, if somebody doesn't attack me, I won't attack him. But if somebody attacks me, then I'm bound to counterattack. And the response is, again in the Chinese phraseology, 有理有利有节. That is to say, 有理 must be justified. I've been attacked. I'm not attacking them. They attack me. 有利, I must be sure that when I do counterattack, that I succeed. It is to my advantage. And 有节 with restraint. Chinese did not set out. At the very beginning, they announced that they did not set out to occupy Vietnamese territory. Their intention was to make it impossible, if not, more difficult, if not impossible, for these provocations to recur. They did that on the Sino-Indian border, and China had a peaceful border at least for 17 years. They did that on the Yalu River. They did that on on the border with the Soviet Union. You may disagree, but from the Chinese point of view, the dangers of allowing such actions to go on are much greater than to counter them in good time. Otherwise, the next step will be Vietnamese expansion into Thailand. And then the danger of Cam Ranh Bay falling into the hands of the Soviet Union as a base will become a reality. The whole strategic situation in Asia will then change, and we will be that much nearer another world war. I think this is the conception behind it. I may have misrepresented it. I don't think so. But regardless of whether we agree or disagree with it, I think we have to take it into consideration. And I'm certain that there are some people who think, well, isn't it great? A couple of communist powers fighting each other. I'm sure there are other people who who say, I hope they destroy each other. But the fact of the matter is that there are serious dangers for the world. From the Chinese vantage point, they are seen much more clearly than perhaps we see them here. But let me assure you that I've met many Europeans, however, who see the situation pretty much the same as the Chinese do, because they are much closer to the danger, and they felt it there much more strikingly, because there are 40,000 battle tanks on the other side of the Oder River, and there are only 10,000 on this side. What conclusions do you draw from that? You need 40,000 tanks to defend yourself against 10,000? In any case, these are the realities as the Chinese see them, and I just present them for your own analysis for what they're worth. Overall, my own feeling about the direction of China today is that there are two fundamental purposes that are motivating the Chinese people today, and they are irreversible. One is modernization, economic growth, as fast as possible. And the second, further social change, especially towards some form of socialist democracy. Those two currents, no leader in China can ever reverse, even though there may be here and there some political turmoil, but those two basic currents are irreversible trends. And in those terms, the movement of China towards the 21st century is predictable, in large pattern, and stable. And therefore, the building of friendship and cooperative relations between the American and Chinese peoples is founded on a solid basis. Thank you.
There are some questions. Maybe we can handle a few up here before we leave.
Yes?
Well, there are border disputes at present between China and Russia. To many of us who live in the West, there seems no basic political difference. Do you feel there is a basic difference in belief between Russian communism and Chinese communism?
The question is, while there are border disputes, we in the West find that perhaps there are no basic differences between Russian and Chinese communism. Is that true? I would say that the basic differences between Russian and Chinese communism are fundamental. And they are based upon two different conceptions of what kind of society should be built. The Soviet Union, I believe, are much more concerned about creating a powerful national state under their leadership, and it means that if it's necessary to create polarities and a stratum of an oppressive bureaucracy, then let it be. The Chinese, I think, are much more concerned about achieving a society that is far more egalitarian. And therefore, their methods differ a great deal. Their methods, particularly in terms of some of the principles that I attributed to Mao Zedong, I think are going to be used regardless of the pace of modernization, people will still adhere to those principles of trying to break down the gaps between leaders and led, between the expert and the layman, between the bureaucracy and the masses. I think that that's irreversible. There's also, of course, great divergencies in the concept of world politics. The Chinese have declared many times that China will never become a superpower, and Deng Xiaoping was the first person to pronounce this publicly at a special session of the United Nations in 1974. And in fact, he said at the time that if China ever becomes a superpower and oppresses other countries, he says we should call upon the people of the world to join in condemning China and helping to overthrow its leadership. And I believe he meant it. Yes.
I have two questions, one leads in the other. A constant theme of Mao's was the learn by doing. And if China was, in essence, participating in a cultural experiment, would you say that some of the seemingly capitalist restorations are the result of learning by experiment what works? I mean, directly fall out of Mao's teachings of learn by doing?
The present experiment, you mean?
Yes.
Well, I don't think that Mao said only that it's, you learn by doing.
Well,
Because that's pragmatism. But I think what the complete formulation would be something like this. The theory is necessary, but the test of theory, or the test of truth, is practice. And you learn most of all from practice, but you also learn from theory.
Is the leadership, as you observe it and understand it then today, from the requirement to test theory in practice, actively pursuing a policy that could be described as a capitalist or superficially capitalist reality while holding forth a socialist ideology as for the future? Is what you were getting at earlier in your talk?
You want to repeat that again?
Okay.
Yeah.
Would it be an accurate or inaccurate description to say that the leadership is now committed to practicing
Capitalism.
a capitalist reality while holding forth a socialist ideology?
I don't think so. By capitalist reality, you're referring to the fact that now you're going back to material incentives and wage differentials and expertise and all that sort of thing. Is that what you mean? Because the basic essence of capitalism is what? It's not those things. The basic essence of capitalism is that the productive forces are in private hands and that private people have a chance to allocate surplus value, allocate the product of that labor privately, according to his own, to this private person's own needs. That is the essence of capitalism, not the emphasis on expertise or wage incentives or differentials in income. These are not the main characteristics of capitalism. I think that's where the confusion lies, because a lot of people are saying today, oh, China's going back to capitalism. I don't believe so, because I don't believe Marx or Lenin or any of the people who talked about socialism along the lines that China believes have ever said that socialism means the elimination of wage differentials or elimination of material incentives.
If we see that red versus expert has been won on the side of expert, and that we're going to, as the Constitution reads, provide from everyone according to ability, to everyone according to their work, okay, which have at least vaguely capitalist overtones, would you say that that China is at least turning in a direction of recognizing more thoroughly the concept of private property. Certainly the market has, in vegetables and agricultural produce, has been constant throughout time. With wage incentives and other institutions coming back, do you see the institution of private property as finding acceptance in the new Chinese scheme of things?
Again, I think we have to distinguish what we mean by private property in consumer goods and private property in producer goods. No society, no socialist society that any of the theorists of socialism that I know of was ever conceived to be without private property in consumer goods. So if you're talking about having your own house, your own little plot of land, your own bicycle and radio and car and so forth, there was never any law against that in China, although the ultra-left tried to do something to deprive people of that. And maybe that's what makes people get the wrong impression, because now they're being restored, including the capitalists who used to own 5% of their interest on their investments. Now they've been restored what was owed them. And certainly people's houses and their possessions should be sacrosanct. But what is not happening is the restoration of the land to the private household peasant, or the restoration of the factories to the private industrialists. That is not happening.
Last question. Is there as you travel in China, I feel totally ignorant to study the situation as much as I like to travel there, being ignorant of the language. In your experiences there recently, do you see a demand on the part of the peasant or on the part of the factory workers and management to actually own the means of production? Is there a demand or a desire there being evidenced now?
I'm sure that there must be these urges in a portion of the population, especially those who came from the former capitalist class. But there's no way in which that can be done. So now in the Soviet Union, there was a strong tendency to restore what they called underground factories, illegal factories. But in China, the free market is practically non-existent in basic commodities. The free market exists only for secondary products, chickens and eggs and pork and so forth, but not for basic staples. So I would say that then there'd be no market for these products. They're all state controlled. And certainly, since it's illegal, they'd find it very difficult to. But I mean, it's a very subjective thing as to whether there are people who have this urge. I think there probably are. Let me just go back very briefly to your read and expert thing, because that's also a very important problem. I'm not sure that what you said is absolutely true, that now it's expert over read rather than read over expert, that values don't count anymore or play a secondary role. I think temporarily that may be a situation that's sort of an overreaction to the old, to the ultra-left position, that all you need to do is to mouth a few slogans and that makes you a great guy, and that you don't have to know any damn thing. You can be totally incompetent and you can get along well. You can get high office, as a matter of fact, like Wang Hongwen did. But I don't think that's true, that now the complete reversal of that is the dominant thing. I think there's a great deal more emphasis on expertise, but it'll be a long time and very difficult for anyone to try to reverse the value system that has been established through these 30 years of under Mao Zedong's leadership. Yes.
We've got just a couple questions.
Yeah.
More.
Yes.
Yes, I had the idea that capitalism is the ability to get because of having and not because of doing.
Right.
Existence of savings banks is then to that extent capitalism. Do they have savings banks in China, and what's the rate of interest?
Professor Allen, that is a very important question. Savings banks are very prevalent in China, and in fact, many people are encouraged to put their savings in the banks. But those savings then become part of the state banking system, and they are used for capital investment by the state. They're not used by the private owner of savings to make surplus value. They're deposited into a state institution, which then makes use of that capital. So in that respect, it is not any encouragement at all to
But
capitalism.
do you know the rate of interest?
Rate of interest is low. I don't know what it is now. It used to be in the neighborhood of 4.5%. Yeah. Yes.
During your talk, you mentioned